Hotel. How's everybody doing? How's everybody doing? Welcome back to Matthew Daniels TV. I am your host, the illustrious scribe, Matthew Daniels. And today we're going to be continuing our theme of Let the Ancestors Speak. Now, I have a really good one for you guys today. Just like always, today we're going to be looking into the life of Bishop Richard Allen, the man who founded the AME Church, or the African Methodist Episcopal Church. AME Church is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, there are a lot of interesting things that I can say about Bishop Richard Allen, and there's a lot of interesting things that I could show you. But in keeping with my theme of letting the ancestors speak, what I'm going to do, I'm going to be giving you a lot of the history of this ancestor, a lot of the history of the AME Church, and what I'm primarily going to be doing is I'm going to give you the history from the perspective of the ancestor who founded that particular denomination, that ancestor being Bishop Richard Allen. So if you give me just a second, I'm going to pull the PowerPoint presentation up. You know, I like to show you guys what I'm talking about as I talk about it. I'm going to pull that presentation up and we are going to get into the information. Now, one of the primary documents that we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at this book right here, The Life, Experience, and Gospel Labors of Right Reverend Richard Allen. Okay, now I'm calling him Bishop Richard Allen because although, yes, he was an ordained minister in the Methodist Church, he was also identified as the bishop, the first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, which is the first African denomination created in America. And it was actually founded in 1816 while a lot of our ancestors were still enslaved. That's another reason why this accomplishment was so powerful. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to be looking at what the Bishop Richard Allen has to say about the founding of the AME Church, the AME denomination. And we're going to be looking at a lot of sources and talking about a lot of history. We're going to be covering a lot of things. Now, one of the things that I want you guys to remember as we go through this is that this particular denomination, the AME denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, it wasn't created like most denominations are. Most denominations of Christianity are formed because of disagreements that individuals have with the current denomination that they are in. They're like spinoffs. How you will have, Protestant, you will have Methodist, you'll have Baptist, you'll have, Jehovah's Witnesses, you'll have Mormons, you have all of these different denominations of Christianity. And these different denominations of Christianity interpret scripture slightly different. They have a lot of things in common, but they view and interpret certain aspects of scripture differently. And so overwhelmingly, when you see new denominations springing up, when someone leaves the denomination that they're in and they create a new denomination, the primary cause of that is differences in doctrine. And so they create a new denomination based on the new doctrine. But this particular denomination, the AME denomination, it was created because of religious persecution. Now, we're going to be getting into that, and that's important to note because if you remember, a lot of us learned that many of the people who immigrated here to what we're calling the United States of America today, they immigrated here quote unquote, because of religious persecution. Now we're going to be dealing with some of that religious persecution. So they were dealing with religious persecution in the European nations that they were in. They came to America to experience religious freedom, and then they in turn persecuted religiously the African American population or the Negro population. And that persecution of the persecuted, the individuals who came here because of religious persecution, in turn began to religiously persecute our ancestors, and that led to the creation of the AME church. So we're going to be dealing with a lot of that religious persecution, and we're going to see exactly how and why the AME church was founded from the perspective of the man who founded it. Okay, this is a very, very good read. If you ever have time, try to get this book, The Life Experience and Gospel Labors of the Right Reverend Richard Allen. And he briefly goes into why he read this book. If you see what I have highlighted here in the preface to the book that he wrote, he says, "I have thought proper for the satisfaction of those who, after I am dead and in the grave, may feel an inclination to learn the commencement of my life, to leave behind me this short account for their perusal." So he's basically saying that he wrote this work for individuals who will be born after he's dead that are interested in his life and his works and the founding of the AME church. He left this short account for them to read and know the firsthand events from his own mouth. So he's talking about us. He's talking directly to us because we are those people who are born after he died. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, let's start right here. So Bishop Richard Allen, the founder and first bishop of the AME Church, he was born February the 14th, 1760, what we know today as Valentine's Day, and he passed away onto the realm of the ancestors March 26th, 1831. Now, the first thing that should stick out to you about those dates is, again, this all happened prior to the Civil War. So our ancestors were still enslaved when this was happening. But we're going to see how Bishop Richard Allen obtained his freedom. He was actually born enslaved as well, and how he was able to, even after being born enslaved, go on to doing something so great as creating the first African denomination in America. So look what it says. Soon after Allen was born to enslaved parents, the family was sold to a Delaware farmer. At age 17, he became a Methodist convert, and at 22 was permitted to preach. 2 years later, 1784, at the first General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church at Baltimore, Allen was considered a talented candidate for the new denomination's ministry. In 1786, he bought his freedom and went to Philadelphia, where he joined St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. Occasionally, he was asked to preach to the congregation. He also conducted prayer meetings for Black congregants. Restrictions were placed on the number permitted to attend these meetings, and Allen, dissatisfied, withdrew in 1787 to help organize an independent Methodist church. In 1787, he turned an old blacksmith shop into the first church for the Black faithful in the United States. So a little background information on Bishop Richard Allen. The way in which he attained his freedom. He was actually enslaved to one of the better slave owners. Now, one can have a moral debate on, can any slave owner be actually good, right? One could have that debate and one could have that discussion. But for the sake of argument, when comparing how some slave owners were to how other slave owners were, the individual that owned Bishop Richard Allen was one of the good ones. And so he did give Bishop Richard Allen and his brother quite a lot of freedom. And he also encouraged them to engage in their religious persuasion, which their religious persuasion was of the Methodist denomination. They were Christians, but they were Methodist Christians. He converted to being a Methodist at around the age 17, and then he and his brother, they would attend certain meetings, certain church services that was officiated by white Methodists who had immigrated to America for the purpose of perpetuating the Methodist faith, which was a quite new denomination on the world scene. We're going to be looking at how the Methodist denomination started here in a second. And so one thing that Bishop Richard Allen tells us in his autobiography, he tells us that some of the other slave owners and some of the other white people who saw that his brother and himself had the ability to stop their work on certain days to go to church, these white people and these other slave owners were condemning the individual that owned Bishop Richard Allen. And they were saying things like, well, you shouldn't allow your slaves to go to so many church meetings, because if you allow them to keep going to these church meetings and not work as hard every day as they should, then you are going to ruin them as slaves. And so Bishop Richard Allen and his brother, he heard these white people saying that. And since he didn't want their accusations to be true, and he didn't want people to talk negatively about the slave master that owned him and his brother decided that they would work twice as hard to finish their work, and they would only go to church services once their work was done. And so they stopped going to every church service that was available, and they only went to church when they didn't have any work to do. And this was so the haters, right, the naysayers, couldn't say that having religion made a slave unfit to be a slave. And they could not bring charges against their slave master, who again was one of the better slave masters in the country at that time. And so what eventually ended up happening is their slave master himself, he got converted. And because of his religious beliefs, he eventually allowed Bishop Richard Allen and his brother to do side jobs to earn money for themselves so that they could eventually purchase their freedom. And after requiring a certain amount of money, they were able to purchase their freedom. And after purchasing their freedom, they Bishop Allen, he was now free. He continued on with the Methodist faith, and he eventually grew to be the man that we're talking about today. Now, another thing that I want to point out about these dates, anytime you're looking at history and you're talking about history, the first thing that you have to ask yourself is, when is this story taking place and where? When and where? When you understand when and where, you're able to put your mind in a particular time frame, so you can automatically understand the context in which the story takes place. So if Bishop Richard Allen is born in 1760, what do we know about 1760? Well, for starters, we know that is prior to the American Revolution. Yes, there is no America as we know America today when Bishop Richard Allen was born. It was what? It was the 13 colonies. Remember, it was the 13 colonies. And these colonies were colonies of European powers. Now, the American Revolution kicked off, and in 1776, America declared its independence from King George the Third, I believe, one of those King George, I believe it was King George the Third of England, They declared their independence. They had the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War ended in around 1783, and then America would began to be known as what we know as America today, as opposed to the 13 colonies. So what you have is Bishop Richard Allen being born in a very, very interesting time in our history. Okay, so moving right along, let's ask, before we get into the creation of the AME church, that particular denomination. We already know that Bishop Richard Allen, he was a Methodist. Okay, but do you know, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you know the history of the Methodist Church? Do you know when the Methodist Church was founded? Do you know who's the man that founded the Methodist denomination? And do you know how and when it actually made it to America? Now I'm going to tell you something. The denomination that we know as Methodist was created in the 1700s itself. And Bishop Richard Allen was alive when the founder of the Methodist denomination was alive. Okay, he was born several decades later, but what happened was, and we're going to look into this, the man named John Wesley, who created the Methodist denomination in England, he sent missionaries and immigrants to America to convert individuals into the Methodist faith. And so actually, not only is Bishop Richard Allen the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, he was actually one of the first Methodists that were actually here. And he was converted and taught by the individuals who actually created the Methodist Church. The Methodist denomination didn't exist for hundreds of years before Bishop Richard Allen came along. No. It actually evolved out of that religious persecution that we're talking about. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you guys back in time, and we're going to build up to the creation of the Methodist denomination. And from the creation of the Methodist denomination, we're going to look into the creation of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination. Okay, so the individual named John Wesley, who created the Methodist denomination, he was actually a member of the Church of England before he broke away and created the Methodist denomination. So in order to go to the beginning, we're going to look at the beginnings of the Church of England. Now, the Church of England, they actually have a website where you can get this information directly from their website themselves and let you tell them who they are. So according to their own website, they say that the roots of the Church of England go back to the time of the Roman Empire, when a Christian church came into existence in what was then the Roman province of Britain. The early Christian writers, Tertullian and Origen, mentioned the existence of a British church in the 3rd century AD. And in the 4th century, British bishops attended a number of the great councils of the church, such as the Council of Arles in 314 and the Council of Rimini in 359. So what are they telling us here? The island that we know as Great Britain today, right? It was not known in recorded history until the Romans got there. It first began to be written about extensively and talked about extensively when the Romans came to Great Britain, because the Romans back then was a powerhouse. And the first Roman to actually lead a war campaign to conquer Great Britain was the man that we know as Julius Caesar. So during the time of Julius Caesar, in around, I believe it was 55 or so BCE, right? Before Christianity was even a thing, before the man that they're calling Jesus was even born, Caesar invaded Britain. And so after several wars, and even individuals continuing those wars, after Caesar died, the country that we know as Great Britain today, it was turned into a Roman province. It was the Roman province of Britain. And the people on the British Isle, they began to take on Roman customs, Roman beliefs, Roman trains of thought, right? And it was actually Winston Churchill who said that the Britons were barbarians and savages until they were conquered by the Romans. And it was the Romans who gave them civilization. And so the British civilization and society that we see today is because of the trajectory that the Roman Empire put Great Britain on. So when you fast forward in time from the wars of Caesar and the conquering of Britain, what we know as Great Britain today, you see that Christianity became a thing. And we see that the Roman Empire made Christianity the state religion. Okay. We know about Emperor Constantine. We know about Theodosian I. We know about these Roman emperors that took hold of Christianity and made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. And so because the emperor of Rome converted to Christianity, many of the areas that were under Roman control began to be converted to Christianity as well, and churches began to pop up there. So Britain was they were no different. They were a Roman province, and so when Christianity became a big thing, then it became a big thing in Britain as well. And so you have what they call the Church of England. The Church of England is just an extension of the Roman Empire's version of Christianity, which is why they were allowed at certain councils, the councils that the Roman Catholic Church held, because they were a part of that. And the Church of England during this time, they were under the Pope. They were subject to the Pope being the bishop of the church at Rome. That's all a Pope is. The Pope is the bishop of the church at Rome. Now, every church had its own bishop. It had its own head. It had its own leader. Now, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, was known as the head of all the bishops. So if you can imagine like a pyramid where you have all the various churches on the bottom, then you have the heads of all of these churches known as bishops, and then you have the head of all these bishops known as the Pope, who is the Bishop of Rome. So the Church of England began as an extension of the Roman Empire. Okay. And so what ended up happening is the Church of England, quote unquote, because of what they were calling religious persecution that happened centuries later, they eventually broke away from the authority of the Pope. They broke away from the authority of the Pope, and they decided to not necessarily create their own denomination, because they were still called the Church of England. They still called themselves Christianity, but they were their own entity. They no longer wanted to be subjected to the Pope. They no longer wanted the Pope to have authority over them. So they was like, you know what? The Church of England, we're going to break away from the Pope. We're going to break away from all of our orders coming down from Rome, and we're going to do our own thing, and we're going to rule ourselves. So that's when we get up to the point to where on the website that they say that where they're talking about a reformed church. Now watch this. Check this out. At the Reformation, the Western Church became divided between those who continued to accept papal authority and the various Protestant churches that did not. The Church of England was among the churches that broke with Rome. The catalyst for this decision was the refusal of the Pope to annul the marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, but also a Tudor nationalist belief that authority over the English church properly belonged to the English monarchy. Now, listen, when they talk about this religious persecution, a lot of times they're going back to the 1500s. Okay, that's when you have what they're calling the Reformation, when the Protestant denomination begins to gain steam and begins to be a thing. And you have people where they're talking about Martin Luther, right? And you have Lutheranism. Well, Martin Luther and his I forget how many theses he wrote, but he basically was condemning the Catholic churches teaching about what is it called, indulgences. Okay, and so a lot of different churches began to have beef with the Pope and the Catholic form of religion, and they all began to break away. That's what they're talking about when they're talking about the Reformation. The Reformation is a time of breaking away from the Roman Catholic order of things. At one point, for several centuries, thousands of years actually, the Pope was in control of these churches. They ran things. And so in around like the 1500s, a lot of churches started breaking away, saying, you know what? We don't agree with what the Catholics are teaching. We don't agree with the Pope. We don't agree with the Pope are teaching. We want to do our own thing. And so at first, the Church of England didn't immediately break away. But the Church of England did break away under the King Henry VIII. And why did King Henry VIII break away? Because in Catholicism, it's not okay to get a divorce, right? And King Henry VIII, he wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she did not give him the child that he wanted, a suitable heir, okay? And so he went to the Pope to get the Pope to annul their marriage, because remember, the church is over marriages and divorces, okay? And so Henry VIII went to the Pope to annul his marriage. The Pope said, no, we're not going to, I'm not going to annul your marriage. You can only get a divorce for things like adultery. You can't just divorce your wife for whatever reason you want. And so King Henry VIII was like, man, you know what? I'm the king. I'm the king of England. I don't even know why I'm listening to you. So he took the Church of England, broke away from the Catholic Church and the Pope, and said that, you know what? Forget the Pope. I'm the sole religious authority over the Church of England. I'm the king anyway. This is how it should be, so that he can give himself the ability to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon. And King Henry VIII, he's also the guy that's known for having several of his wives killed. He was a very vicious man of the Tudor dynasty. The Tudor dynasty being one of the most famous dynasties in England. Okay, so look, they say, and just some little sources to back up what I'm saying. Henry VIII is known for his 6 marriages and his efforts to have his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled. His disagreement with Pope Clement VII about such an annulment led Henry to initiate the English Reformation, separating the Church of England from papal authority. He appointed himself supreme head of the Church of England and dissolved convents and monasteries for which he was excommunicated by the Pope. Now, excommunication is something that the Catholic Church did, whereas if you didn't subject yourself to their rule, if you didn't bow down to their rule, they would excommunicate you, basically like kick you out of the church. And so what King Henry VIII did, he just took the Church of England and he said, you know what? I'm going to separate from all papal authority. The Pope don't tell us what to do no more. Since I'm the king, I'm the supreme head of the Church of England, and we're going to do things how I say that we want to do them. And this began to be known as the English Reformation, because this is when the Church of England decided to break away. But again, remember, there were already other reformations going on, the Reformation of Martin Luther, etc., etc. The Catholic Church broke up into a lot of different splinter groups around this time. Now, not only did, and we're building up, remember, we're building up to how the Methodist faith came about, and we're building up to Bishop Richard Allen. But we just want to cover a little history. Now, when King Henry VIII broke away from the papal authority and the Roman Catholic Church, he also commissioned to have his own translation of the Bible written. And this Bible was known as the Great Bible, and it was written in 1539 or translated in 1539. Now, this is before we get to the King James version of the Bible in 1611. But this is what laid the groundwork for King James to have his version of the Bible written in 1611, because again, King James was a member of the Church of England, and had King Henry VIII never broke away from papal authority, had he never authorized his great Bible to be written, then King James would never have done what he did. Okay, so it is because of this man ultimately that we even have the King James version of the Bible, and that's the main Bible that a lot of us use, right? But he was following in the authority of King Henry VIII. So look what they say. The Great Bible of 1539 was the first authorized edition of the Bible in English, authorized by the king. Okay, the king, who is the new supreme authority over the church, not a bishop, not a priest, not clergy. The king is the final authority on the church. Now, look, it was authorized by King Henry VIII of England to be read aloud in the church services of the Church of England. And so with his breakaway, he was also like, we need to have our own Bible. Now, some of you know this already, but the main Bible that we have, the King James version of the Bible, which comes from the Church of England, it has a different canon of books, a different list of books than the Catholic Church. The Catholic Bible has more books in it than the King James version of the Bible. One of the reasons for this is because the Church of England broke away from the Pope, and then they began to do their own thing with the Bible. They were able to pick their own books and put their own books in, and they didn't have to no longer use the same books that the Catholic Church used, and so they were able to do their own thing. But even the King James version of the Bible that we have today is different from the Great Bible, and it's actually different from the King James version of the Bible that was originally commissioned, because both the Great Bible and the original King James Bible had the apocryphal books in it. But in America, I believe in around the 1800s, they took the apocryphal books out. That's why you in 2024, you don't have the apocryphal books in the actual Bible itself, because you know the Bible has been changed. The list of books, the canon of books, has been changed several times, and you can even see King Henry VIII going out of his way to identify himself as the sole authority over the church, not the Pope, him. Because what you're seeing on your screen on the left, that is an actual photocopy of the Great Bible that King Henry VIII had created. Now, on the right is a colored picture of the image that's on the top of the Great Bible. Look at this. And I know it's kind of fuzzy, but you have seated on the throne in the center, that's King Henry VIII right there. And what he's doing in either hand, on his left and his right, he's handing the Bible to the top members of the clergy. And he's handing the Bible to them, saying that now we will no longer use that Catholic Bible that the Catholics have been having us using. We will use this. This is now to be read in all of the churches. And so we see this colored version of it. You can kind of, still blurry, but you can see it a little better. Him handing these books. That's him handing the Great Bible to these other individuals. Okay, So you have in England, right? You have the people in that area not being Christians at all. They were Celt. They followed the Celtic religion and the Druid religion. They were conquered by Rome. They became a province of Rome. When Rome converted to Christianity, they converted Britain to Christianity. So they created the Church of England under Rome. They were under the authority of the Pope until this guy, King Henry VIII, came along in the 1500s. He broke away, made the Church of England its own entity, and he made the king the head of the of the Church of England. Now, it is this Church of England whose authority is in the king that the man John Wesley, who created the Methodist faith, was a part of. This was his religion before he created the Methodist denomination. Okay, so we're walking forward in history. So now we're going to look at the history of the Methodist Church. Now, this is Reverend John Wesley. Okay, now he was born June 28, 1703, and he died March 2nd, 1791. So he passed away some 31 years after Bishop Richard Allen was born. So while Bishop Richard Allen was a Methodist, John Wesley was still alive. So let's look at a little bit of the history of the Methodist Church, and let's see how it got to America in the first place for Bishop Richard Allen to pick it up. They say that both John and Charles were Church of England priests who volunteered as missionaries to the colony of Georgia, arriving in March 1736. Their mission was far from an unqualified success, and both returned to England disillusioned and discouraged. Charles in December 1736 and John in February 1738. The Wesley brothers had transforming religious experiences in May 1738 under the influence of Moravian missionaries. John's experience on May 24th of that year at a Moravian meeting on Aldersgate Street, London, has a prominent place in the church's memory. Shortly thereafter, both brothers began preaching a message of new birth and sanctification in Anglican religious societies and outdoors to whomever would listen. They also established missional and philanthropic enterprises to promote social change. So what they're basically saying is that the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, they had these transforming, quote unquote, transforming religious experiences where they began to have doctrinal differences with the Church of England. And so they began to preach a new denomination, a new way to interpret the scriptures, and this became known as Methodism, or the Methodist denomination. And so they began to go around promoting this message as missionaries, trying to convert people to their new religious belief. Now, one of the things that they did, they not only went around Britain, and areas that in the area that we're calling Great Britain today, trying to convert people. Another thing they did, they also went across the shores to the colonies. Remember, they were colonies at first. They went to the colonies, the British colonies, to convert the individuals over here to the Methodist religion as well. And one of the individuals who were converted was the ancestor Bishop Richard Allen. Now, one of the things about the Methodists, they didn't mind trying to convert the Africans into their faith. They weren't really for slavery. They were kind of against slavery, but they weren't total abolitionists. They weren't trying to destroy it. They were just trying to spread their message throughout the English Empire, and America was a colony of Great Britain at the time. So they came to America preaching about this new faith. And so while they were here preaching about this new faith, they converted the Bishop Richard Allen. He ran with it. He became a Methodist. And then we're going to see how from that he creates the African Methodist Episcopal denomination. We're going to see, we're seeing how these religious denominations, these understandings of the scriptures, how they evolve and change over time. Now, look, this is the beginnings of Methodism in America. It says Methodism in America began without authorization or support from England as lay Methodists immigrated to America. The first Methodist societies included active participation by people of European and African descent. The American Revolution profoundly impacted Methodism. John Wesley's loyalty to the king and his writings against the revolutionary cause did not enhance the image of Methodism among many who supported independence. Furthermore, a number of Methodist preachers refused to bear arms to aid the patriots. When independence from England was won, Wesley recognized that changes were necessary for American Methodism to thrive. Now, I want you guys to remember some of these names. He sent Thomas Coke to America to superintend the work with Asbury. Coke brought with him a prayer book entitled The Sunday Service of the Methodists in North America, prepared by Wesley and incorporating his revision of the Church of England's 39 Articles of Religion. Richard Whatcoat and Thomas Vassie, whom Wesley had ordained, accompanied Coke. Wesley's ordination set a precedent that ultimately permitted Methodists in America to become an independent church. In December 1784, the famous Christmas Conference of Preachers was held in Baltimore at Lovely Lane Chapel. Most of the American preachers attended, probably including African Americans Harry Hoser and Richard Allen. That's the same Richard Allen that we're doing this video about. At this gathering, the movement became organized as the Methodist Episcopal Church in America. In the following years, the Methodist Episcopal Church published its first discipline in 1784. It adopted a quadrennial general conference, the first of which was held in 1792, and drafted a constitution in 1808. It also established a publishing house and became a proponent of revivalism and the camp meetings. So Methodism came to America before the Revolutionary War took place. After the Revolutionary War took place, they realized that they had to adapt to the new reality, that America was no longer a colony of Britain. It was its own independent nation. And so they began to be permitted to have Methodists in America. And they really were just kind of like Jehovah's Witnesses. If you know how Jehovah's Witnesses, they are known for they go from door to door, talking to people, trying to convert people, telling people about their beliefs, professing why their beliefs are better and more in line with the Bible than the beliefs that you might already have. And so they went around America doing that, and they were preaching to not only the Europeans, but they were also promoting and preaching to the Africans. And so we see that even in their from the Methodist church's own accounts of their creations and beginnings in America, they mentioned Richard Allen being there from the very beginning, because this December 1784 Christmas conference was one of the most important conferences and the first conference that they actually had as a denomination. And they're letting us know that the ancestor Richard Allen was there. Remember, he was converted to Methodism, and because of his ability to speak and his willingness to work, they began to allow him to preach so that he can preach and convert other individuals that were enslaved, because he was still enslaved when he became a Methodist, right? And so they were using him. And so even after he gained his freedom, he continued to preach and hold meetings in a certain capacity. So with all of that said, now let's get to the actual book written by Bishop Richard Allen himself. And we're going to allow the ancestor to speak and tell us about his hold on, give me just a second. We're going to let him tell us about his experiences in the Methodist Church. I see I missed a couple of comments. Lil something says, "What up, Matt? Thanks for the knowledge. Hey, no problem. Thank you for tapping in." Brooklyn Zoo says, "Hotep King." Hey, Hotep to you too, fam. I hope y'all still in the building. I kind of missed those comments because I had the screen share up. No doubt, no doubt. I hope everybody is enjoying the show. All right, we're going to get back into the PowerPoint, and we're going to get into the writings of Bishop Richard Allen himself. All right, give me just a second. Let me blow that up. Okay. Now, remember I told you guys to remember some of those names, and I told you guys to remember what they were saying on the actual website itself, because that Christmas conference that they say Richard Allen was most likely at, he mentions that in his writings. He talks about that. I have it highlighted here. He says, look, December 1784 General Conference, that's the Christmas conference, sat in Baltimore, the first general conference ever held in America. So he's talking about the first general conference of the Methodists being held in America. He's right there on the scene of the beginnings of the Methodist movement. He says the English preachers just arrived from Europe, Reverend Dr. Coke, Richard Whatcoat, and Thomas Vassie. This was the beginning of the Episcopal Church among the Methodists. Many of the ministers were set apart in holy orders at this conference and were said to be entitled to the gown. And I have thought religion has been declining in the church ever since. So we see the ancestor in his work. He's telling us about these immigrants, these missionaries coming from Europe overseas to lay the foundation for what's known as the Methodist movement in America. Now, remember, they're purporting to do this because of religious persecution. There has been documented hundreds of years of quote unquote religious persecution in England. And so in America, they're talking about you have this freedom of religion. You can believe whatever you want to believe, and they're against the religious persecution. But what we're going to see is that they, although they were trying to flee religious persecution in Europe, they began to religiously persecute the people over here in America, which led the bishop to create the AME denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, because the immigrant Methodists were doing to our ancestors exactly what they claimed that was done to them in Europe. But you see, the ancestor name is some of the same names. He names Reverend Dr. Coate, Richard Whatcoat, and Thomas Vassie. These are the same people who are mentioned on the official Methodist website. Richard Whatcoat, Thomas Vassie, and Coate. And he's even going to tell us about Asbury. Now, Asbury was one of the most influential people when dealing with Methodism in America outside of the founder, John Wesley. But let's see what the ancestor says. He says there was a pamphlet published by some person which stated that when the Methodists were no people, they were a people. And now they have become a people that were no people, which had often serious weight upon my mind. Basically, all he's trying to say is that when Methodism first started, when everybody first began to be Methodist, it was all good. It was all love. Everybody seemed to really be involved in religion and trying to save people's souls. But the religion, the denomination was on the decline right from that moment on. And that happens a lot of times too, when it goes from just preaching the gospel to actually incorporating it, making it a corporation, setting standards, setting leaders, setting boards, holding conferences. It begins to get oppressive because the individuals in charge now begin to tell people what to do. And it's not just telling the gospel message, it's telling people how to tell the gospel message, et cetera, et cetera. So look what he says. In 1785, the Reverend Richard Whatcoat was appointed on Baltimore Circuit. And we know this is he's giving us accurate historical information because we've seen it in other sources. He was, I believe, a man of God, I found great strength in traveling with him, a father in Israel. So Bishop Richard Allen is traveling, right? Doing this missionary work of preaching with one of the founders of Methodism in America. That's big. He's not a Johnny come lately. In his advice, he was fatherly and friendly. He was of a mild and serene disposition. My lot was cast in Baltimore in a small meeting house called Methodist Alley. I stopped at Richard Mauld's and was sent to my lodgings and lodged at Mr. McCannon's. I had some happy meetings in Baltimore. I was introduced to Richard Russell, who was very kind and affectionate to me and attended several meetings. And so what the ancestor is doing, he's telling us about how he got involved with the Methodist religion, some of the work that he did for the Methodist faith, and then he's going to get into what he experienced that caused him to create his own denomination, why he didn't just stick with the denomination that was created. Look, he says, Reverend Bishop Asbury sent for me to meet him at Henry Gaff's. I did so. He told me he wished me to travel with him. He told me that in the slave countries, Carolina and other places, I must not intermix with the slaves, and I would frequently have to sleep in his carriage, and he would allow me my victuals and clothes. I told him I would not travel with him on these conditions. Now, two takeaways. That Reverend Bishop Asbury, that he's saying sent for him and asked him to travel with him and do missionary work. Remember, he is literally, that Asbury fellow, he is literally the most important person to Methodism in America by far. He is the most important. And so when you understand that the ancestor had direct contact with this guy, again, you know that Bishop Richard Allen is right there at the heart of the creation and expansion of Methodism in America. And so what happened was, he says that Bishop Asbury wanted him to travel with him through some of the, what he's calling the slave countries, the Carolinas and other places, basically the South. Okay. Because remember, Bishop Richard Allen has bought his freedom, but the Civil War hasn't happened yet. So there is still several slave states. Now, Bishop Richard Allen is currently, he's on the move. He's like a traveling missionary, but he's basically stationed in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was a place that had a high population of quote unquote free Negroes. And so Bishop Richard Asbury wanted him to travel to these slave states with him so that they could do this missionary work. But the ancestor, Bishop Richard Allen, was like, nah, I'm not going to be able to do that, not under those conditions. And he gives his reasons why. But I have to believe that one of the reasons why as well is because it just wasn't safe, right? I mean, it just wasn't safe. Although he was free, there was still a distinct caste system in America, whites on top, blacks on the bottom. And it would have been nothing for him to be beaten, killed, abused, tortured, or even kidnapped and enslaved on one of those plantations. And there would literally be nothing. There would be nothing that Reverend Bishop Asbury could do to save him. If one of those people in the South wanted to harm him, he couldn't help him. He couldn't. They would not acquiesce to the fact that he said he was a holy man, he was a reverend, he was a bishop. The plantation owners in the South wouldn't care. None of that would have mattered. So although he gives his reasoning, I also believe some of his reasoning was as in that he just didn't want to go into the South and just be going around because it was dangerous. You know, he already had experienced slavery. He was born a slave. Why put himself in a position to get taken back into slavery? You know, that wouldn't make sense. But Bishop Richard Asbury, he goes on to say he tried to convince Bishop Richard Allen to go with him, and he would take care of him and he would be safe. But ultimately, the ancestor says, but I made up my mind that I would not accept of his proposal. So he said, no, I'm not going to be going into the South with you. He says, shortly after I left Hartford Circuit and came to Pennsylvania on Lancaster Circuit, I traveled several months on Lancaster Circuit with the Reverend Peter Morat. And Erie Ellis. They were very kind and affectionate to me in building me up, for I had many trials to pass through, and I received nothing from the Methodist connection. My usual method was, when I would get bare of clothes, to stop traveling and go to work, so that no man could say I was chargeable to the connection. My hands administered to my necessities. The autumn of 1785, I returned again to Randor. I stopped at George Ginger's, a man of God, and went to work. Now, pay attention to the date, 1785. Remember, the American Revolution ended in 1783. Now, after that is when they were reforming and revising the Methodist movement so that it could take hold in this new America that was not a colony of Britain. Because these reverends, these bishops that came from Europe, they were British, right? They were British. And at first they were coming to a British colony. But then when they seen that America, we had shook the spot, we had revolted against the British, we had disconnected all ties to the king, they was like, oh, okay, wait a minute. We're not over here. We can't say we on behalf of the king. We got no more authority like that. That's America. We have to change things. And so what they did exactly what the Jehovah's Witnesses do today. They were traveling. They were going door to door. They were going to different counties trying to convert people to this new Methodist faith. And right there at the groundwork, we see the ancestor Bishop Richard Allen. He's going around putting in this work as well. He put in some of the groundwork to not only spread the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, but the regular Methodist denomination as a whole. That's what we have to understand. He was influential in Methodism itself becoming a major thing. And so he's describing how he's going from place to place preaching the word. Look, he says, I stopped at George Jiggers, a man of God, and went to work. His family were all kind and affectionate to me. I killed 7 beeves and supplied the neighbors with meat. I'm assuming as beavers. Got myself pretty well clad through my own industry, thank God, and preached occasionally. The elder in charge of Philadelphia frequently sent for me to come to the city. February 1786, I came to Philadelphia. Preaching was given out for me at 5 o'clock in the morning at St. George's Church. I strove to preach as well as I could, but it was a great cross to me. But the Lord was with me. We had a good time, and several souls were awakened and were earnestly seeking redemption in the blood of Christ. I thought I would stop in Philadelphia a week or two. I preached at different places in the city. My labor was much blessed. I soon saw a large field open in seeking and instructing my African brethren who had been a long forgotten people, and few of them attended public worship. Now, what this makes me think about is the early disciples and even Paul. You know how Paul would go from town to town, city to city, and he would form churches there and he'll preach with them a little bit, teach with them a little bit. And when he moved on to the next place, he would try to keep some type of open lines of communication to the quote unquote churches or the groups that he helped found in these different places. The ancestor Bishop Allen was doing much the same thing, going from place to place, which is actually one of the founding beliefs of Methodism. John Wesley said that he wanted to get the church back to the faith of the original disciples. And he wanted to have a church that was like the church that we read about in the book of Acts. And so if you think about it, when you read about the church in the book of Acts and you read about the first disciples and Paul and Peter and Bartholomew, etc., they were going around preaching the gospel, converting people, establishing churches, and moving on to the next place while keeping in contact with the churches that they founded. Because remember, they are breaking away from the Church of England to create their own thing. And so in order to create their own thing, they have to go around and tell people about it, because nobody knows what a Methodist is until they go and tell them about it. right? And so the ancestor was going around with them in this discipleship type way, this Pauline type way, creating churches in America. And so the ancestor says that he comes to Philadelphia, and there is a Methodist church that we're gonna be looking at here in a second, called St. George's Church. That's a very, very important historical church, St. George's Church. Now, he was permitted to preach the 5 o'clock service. So at 5 a.m., he's the individual giving the preaching. And so he's saying that while he was going around with these European immigrants who came to promote the Methodist faith, while he's going around with them, he's seeing that there is a great opportunity for him to convert his African brethren to the Methodist religion, the religion that he held. Now, a lot of them have already been exposed to Christianity because Christianity has been a thing for thousands of years, but they have not been exposed to this new faith of Methodism because it is just now beginning. And so he says, my labor was much blessed. I soon saw a large field open in seeking and instructing my African brethren who had been a long forgotten people, and few of them attended public worship. So the ancestor is saying that while they're going around, they're doing this missionary work. Yes, they were attending to the African people as well. This is obvious because Richard Allen was able to convert, but primarily they were converting the Europeans. They were converting the white population. And so the ancestor says while he's doing his work, he's looking up and he's saying like, man, wait a minute. You know what? A lot of my brethren could use this life-saving message, this soul-saving message. And so from very early on, his goal had began to be to get this life-saving, soul-saving gospel message to his people. Look, he says, I established prayer meetings. I raised a society in 1786 of 42 members. I saw the necessity of erecting a place of worship for the colored people. I proposed it to the most respectable people of color in the city, but here I met with opposition. So now he's getting the idea that he wants to bring this message to the Negroes, the colored society, the people of African descent. And so he starts establishing prayer meetings, and he establishes a society of 42 members. And he decides that, you know what, I want to build a place of worship. I want to create a church for the black people, right? Where they can come and they can get this life-saving, soul-saving message. But he says that it was here that he began to be met with opposition. Now, remember, he's traveling with all of the movers and shakers in the Methodist movement. They're taking him everywhere. They're asking for him specifically to go here, go there, and help them teach this message. So obviously they have no problem with him teaching his message until he says, you know what? I want to build a church for black people like y'all have these other churches, and so I can teach them as well. And so then these Methodists who are claiming to be escaping religious persecution in Europe, they begin to oppress him and say, whoa, wait a minute. Nobody said anything about building a church for colored people. That's not what we're doing here. That's not the plan. And they began to push back and fight against this idea with vitriol. Look, he says, I had but 3 colored brethren that united with me in erecting a place of worship: the Reverend Absalom Jones, William White, and Dorius Jennings. Now, Reverend Absalom Jones, you may have heard of that name, but he's another powerhouse when you're talking about the descendants of slaves, early Africans or Negroes back during the time of slavery, who attained their freedom and did many works for the Christian church. So this Absalom Jones, he was right there working hand in hand with Bishop Richard Allen. So look what he says. He says that These united with me as soon as it became public and known by the elder who was stationed in the city. The Reverend CB, he omits his name, but he gives us his initials, opposed the plan and would not submit to any argument we could raise. But he was shortly removed from the charge. The Reverend Mr. W took the charge, and the Reverend LG, Mr. W, was much opposed to an African church and used very degrading and insulting language to us to try and prevent us from going on. Now, think about that. They're going all around America preaching the message of Methodism, converting people, erecting churches, etc., etc. But then you have these people saying like, hey, while we're doing this, hey, let's build an African church. Let's build an African church and teach this Methodist faith to the Africans. And then all of these immigrants from Britain and the people that they're converting over here, the people that were in charge, they were like, whoa, 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 whoa. Yes, we're converting people. Yes, we're building churches, but we will not build an African church. That's nonsense. And so here begins the understanding that they aren't as religious as they claim to be. They still have this racism inside of them somewhere because they do not want these people to build an African church. Although that's the only thing that they're doing is building churches. Look, the ancestor says we all belong to St. George's Church. Reverend Absalom Jones, William White, and Dorius Jennings. And so they belong to this St. George's Church. And so a lot of the pushback that they got was from the members of St. George's Church and individuals that were connected to St. George's Church. And so here comes the persecution. And Bishop Richard Allen, he sees that, okay, I'm doing, along with my brethren, we're doing all of this work for the Methodist movement. We're building all of these churches. We're converting all of these people. But when we said that we wanted to build an African church, y'all giving us pushback. Y'all insulting us. Y'all degrading us. Y'all cussing us out. And they begin to see like, damn, wait a minute, man. You guys are persecuting us. And so what always happens when this persecution becomes, and when you have disagreements, another denomination springs forth. So it was almost as in the African Methodist Episcopal denomination most likely never would have became a thing if these European immigrants who were found in Methodism never began to persecute the Africans. If they never would have done that, they would have had no cause to create the AME church. But they pushed the ancestors into creating that. And one of the situations that the ancestor describes is they actually began to get physical persecution, not just name calling, but they actually began to get physically persecuted for their endeavors to create an African church. And Bishop Richard Allen, he describes one such account, really the account that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Look, so remember, he's preaching at St. George's at 5 a.m. every day. They're having prayer meetings, they're having worship services, they're members of St. George's Methodist Church. They're involved. So look what he says. A number of us usually attended St. George's Church in 4th Street, and when the colored people began to get numerous in attending the church, they moved us from the seats we usually sat on and placed us around the wall. And on Sabbath morning, we went to church, and the sexton stood at the door and told us to go in the gallery. So they allowed the people of African descent to come to church, worship with them. But when too many started coming, they made them stand up and stand on the wall. Why? To save seats for the white patrons. Then one day when they came in, they had somebody standing at the door and was like, hey, we don't even want you down here with the rest of the people anyway, with the white people. We want you to go up there in the gallery. Y'all can go up there in the gallery and hold service with us up there. Now, what's disgusting about this is because that's exactly how the church services was taking place in the southern states, right? On the actual plantations where they actually had slaves. That's how they treated the slaves. When they would force the slaves to go to church, they would have the white section and they would have the black section. And sometimes the black people, they would have to stand outside. They would have to go into the loft or the gallery. They would have to stand along the walls, and they would get two separate messages. And so what happened was, when the black people were helping them convert white people, it was all good. But then when so many black people started to get converted and they started trying to see themselves as equal within the Methodist Church, the leaders of the Methodist Church had a problem with it. And they began to treat them how the individuals who were enslaved were being treated in the churches in the South. He said, he told us to go and we would see where to sit. So we expected to take the seats over the ones we formerly occupied below, not knowing any better. We took those seats. So they went to the place to where they thought they were going to sit down. So they didn't know exactly how bad this persecution was going to be, because they were still seeing these men as godly men, not racist. So he says, the meeting had begun and they were nearly done singing. And just as we got to our seats, the elder said, let us pray. We had not been long upon our knees before I heard considerable scuffling and low talking. I raised my head up and saw one of the trustees, H.M., having hold of the Reverend Absalom Jones, pulling him up off of his knees and saying, you must get up. You must not kneel here. So they were kicked out of their seats, made to stand on the walls. Then they were made to go in the gallery. And so now they're in the gallery and everybody in the church service is praying. So they get on their knees to pray too. They're literally in prayer, right? And then one of the trustees of the church, this is like, a deacon or something, a high-ranking member in the church. He grabs Absalom Jones, jerks him up off of his knees mid-prayer and say, nah, you can't kneel here. No African can kneel here. So now they're trying to control where he can pray. So Mr. Jones replied, wait until prayer is over. Like, I ain't going nowhere. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to pray. He stood up for himself. Mr. H.M. said, no, you must get up now or I will call for aid and force you away. So he's threatening to kick them out of the church for praying in a place where they don't want him to pray. Mr. Jones said, wait until prayer is over and I will get up and trouble you no more. With that, he beckoned to one of the other trustees, Mr. L.S., to come to his assistance. He came and went to William White to pull him up. By this time, prayer was over and we all went out of the church in a body, and they were no more plagued with us in that church. So that's what we call the straw that broke the camel's back. Remember, they were already talking about creating an African church. They were getting a lot of pushback. They were being cussed at. They were being degraded. They were being insulted, and they were refusing to allow them to do this. And so they were trying to stick it out. But when they were literally almost forced out with violence in the middle of prayer, that's when they said to themselves, okay, you know what? We can't really attend St. George's Church anymore. This is not a place for us. And so I'm assured that in that moment they really had their heart set on the fact that they had to create a church for themselves. Now, when we're talking about this St. George, this church, is St. George's United Methodist Church in Philadelphia. This is the church that the ancestor is talking about. Look what they say. St. George's United Methodist Church, located at the corner of 4th and New Street in the Old City neighborhood of Philadelphia, is the oldest Methodist church in continuous use in the United States, beginning in 1769, before the Revolutionary War. The congregation was founded in 1767, meeting initially in a cell loft on Dock Street, and in 1769 it purchased the shell of a building which had been erected in 1763 by a German Reformed congregation. At this time, Methodists had not yet broken away from the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and the Methodist Episcopal Church was not founded until 1784. Now, again, when the Methodist Episcopal Church was actually founded as such, that 1784 date is that Christmas conference that Richard Allen attended. So again, he was there at the beginning of the Methodist Episcopal Church actual founding in America. We can't get away from that. Richard Allen and Bishop Richard Allen, they don't call him Bishop, but I'm calling him Bishop, and Absalom Jones became the first African Americans licensed by the Methodist Church, licensed to preach. They were licensed in St. George's Church in 1784. 3 years later, protesting racial segregation in the worship services, Allen led most of the black members out of St. George's Church. Allen's camp founded the Mother Bethel AME Church and the African Methodist Episcopal denominations, while Jones became an Episcopal priest, founding the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. Now, remember that Mother Bethel AME Church, because I'm going to show you that later. So what they're talking about is exactly what the Ancestor says in his book. That's the St. George Methodist Church. Okay. Now, again, look how despicable and disgusting this is. They were there at the beginning. They were there at the founding of the Episcopal denomination when they actually broke away from the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is the Church of England that I told you guys about. That broke away from the Pope with King Henry VIII. Right? And they were the first African Americans licensed to preach. But shortly thereafter, 3 years later, they began to suffer racial segregation and racial persecution in the church that they were literally helping to found, that they were literally helping to spread. This is how they're looking at it, like, damn, I'm putting in all this work for you guys. And then you turn around and y'all racist towards us as well. Crazy. And so this is the St. George's Methodist Church that tried to kick them out in the middle of prayer and made them say, well, you know what? We're not dealing with this no more. We're going to have to create our own thing. So at this point in the book, Bishop Richard Allen describes how they are threatened with excommunication from the Methodist Church. And they're threatened to excommunicate him because he wants to build an African church. They're saying, before we let you build an African church under the title of Methodist, we'll just excommunicate you and kick you out. Now, what's wild about that is, remember, we're talking about this so-called religious persecution. Remember, the man that founded the Church of England, which the Methodist Church comes out of the Church of England, was King Henry VIII. Or he didn't found it, but he founded it as a breakaway denomination from the Roman Catholic denomination. And they were saying that the Pope tried to excommunicate them. One of the things that the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church did to persecute people that didn't want to listen and fall in line was just excommunicate them, kick them out the church. And so these guys are doing the same exact thing that they were complaining were done to them. But the only thing that they're trying to do is build an African church in America. And for that, they were being oppressed and told that they were going to be excommunicated, meaning they were no longer going to be allowed to be Methodist. Look what he says. I hope the name of Dr. Benjamin Rush and Mr. Robert Ralston will never be forgotten among us. They were the first two gentlemen who espoused the cause of the oppressed and aided us in building the house of the Lord for the poor Africans to worship in. Here was the beginning and rise of the first African church in America. But the elder of the Methodist Church still pursued us. Mr. J.M. called upon us and told us If we did not erase our names from the subscription paper and give up the paper, we would be publicly turned out of meeting. So what he's talking about there, that may not make sense, but how he says if the elder of the Methodist Church is telling him to take his name off of the subscription paper and give up the paper, what that is remember, Methodists were like traveling salesmen. They were going door to door converting people, but they were also going door to door collecting donations. And what they would do, in order to build a church, you need money, right? But if you don't already have a congregation that's giving you money, that's donating to the offering every Sunday, where does the money come from? Well, the Methodists had a system called subscription or subscription papers. When they would go door to door, they would espouse their cause and they would ask the people, are you willing to donate a certain amount of money to help us build a church? And the person may say no, or the person may say, yes, I'll give you $50 to help you build the church. And so with that subscription paper, they would write down, Mr. John Q. Public is willing to donate $50. Then they would go to the next house. Okay, Mrs. Mary Q. Public is willing to donate $25. Okay, and so this subscription paper was a list of names and donation amounts that were going to help Bishop Richard Allen and others build the African church. And so the elder of the Methodist Church was saying, you need to erase your names off of that subscription paper and give that paper up, or they would be publicly turned out of meetings, saying, if you continue to try to raise money to build an African church, we will kick you out of the Methodist Church, period. That's what he's describing. So in response to that, he says, we asked him if we have violated any rules of discipline by doing so. Now, these rules of discipline are the rules and regulations that the Methodist Church or the Methodist church members had to follow. Okay, you have to, in order to be kicked out of the church, you have to violate rules. So the rules of discipline are the rules that you are supposed to adhere to. If you don't adhere to those rules, there will be consequences. So they're saying, okay, wait a minute. Did we violate any of the rules of discipline? If so, we'll give up these papers. So the elder of the Methodist Church, he replied, I have the charge given to me by the conference, the Christmas conference, and unless you submit, I will read you publicly out of meeting. We told him we were willing to abide by the discipline of the Methodist Church. And if you will show us where we have violated any law of discipline of the Methodist Church, we will submit. And if there is no rule violated in the discipline, we will proceed on. He replied, we will read you all out. Notice he's never explaining a rule of discipline that they violated. He's just saying this out of racial hate. We don't want you to build an African church. He says, we told him if he turned us out contrary to rule of discipline, we should seek further redress. And I appreciate these brothers standing on business. Right? Standing on business. But it could also be seen as begging to be a part of something that they don't want you to be a part of, which I might head off to them is because they eventually created the AME denomination. It was like, look, we sick of this foolishness. We just going to create our own denomination. Richard Allen is going to be the bishop of it. We're going to create our own rules of faith, our own rules of discipline. Yes, we'll still be connected to the Methodist movement, but we're going to have our own say-so. Y'all can't just tell us what to do. Y'all are not in control of our souls. But I appreciate them standing on business, saying that you can't just kick us out the church. You can't just excommunicate us. You got to have a reason. You can't persecute us. So look, they say, we told him we were dragged off of our knees in St. George's Church and treated worse than heathens. And we were determined to seek out for ourselves, the Lord being our helper. He told us we were not Methodists and left us. Finding we would go on in raising money to build the church, he called upon us again and wished to see us all together. We met him. He told us that he wished us well, that he was a friend to us, and used many arguments to convince us that we were wrong in building a church. So look at how slick he is. So when they refused to stop gathering money and they demanded to know what rule they had violated, this guy, he went back obviously to the other people that were in charge of the Methodist Church. He told them what was going on. They looked at the rules of discipline and they said, well, you know what? We have no quote unquote legal resource. They aren't violating any rules, so we can't stop them. So what they did then is they were like, okay, we have to trick them. Now, again, these are supposed to be Christians, but their racism outweighed their faith. So they were like, we have to trick them. So he goes back to Bishop Richard Allen and he says, okay, look, you know what? I wish y'all well, right? I wish y'all well. I hope y'all all endeavors that I hope y'all achieve everything that you want to achieve. I'm actually you guys' friend. And then he tried to convince them that they were wrong, why they were wrong in building a church, although it wasn't against any rules. He trying to just get them to be like, okay, he's our friend. He like us. You know, he just trying to tell us the right thing to do, yada, 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 and trick them to stop. But thank goodness they didn't. He says, we told him we had no place of worship, and we did not mean to go to St. George's Church anymore, as we were so scandalously treated in the presence of all the congregation present, period. And if you deny us your name, you cannot seal up the scriptures from us and deny us a name in heaven. So he's basically saying, look, man, we did everything y'all wanted us to do. Everything. But look how y'all kicked us out of St. George's while we were in the middle of prayer. We got no respect there. No respect. Y'all have to respect us. And if y'all don't want to respect us, we're going to build our own church, and it's nothing you can do to stop us. He said, we believe heaven is free for all who worship in spirit and truth. And he said, so you are determined to go on? We told him, yes, God being our helper. He then replied, we will disown you all from the Methodist connection. So after pretending to be his friend, his true feelings came out after he couldn't convince them with his lies. And he basically said, we're going to excommunicate you. We believe if we put our trust in the Lord, he would stand by us. And so he goes on to describe some more of the persecutions that they endured. Is one thing I'm going to see if it's on this particular page. It was more sinister things that happened. Hold on, check this out. Look, watch this. He says, we bore much persecution from many of the Methodist connections. So the persecutions got in full swing at this point. But we have reason to be thankful to Almighty God, who was our deliverer. The day was appointed to go and dig the cellar. I arose early in the morning and addressed the throne of grace, praying that the Lord would bless our endeavors. Having by this time 2 or 3 teams of my own, as I was the first proposer of the African church, I put first I didn't put that next page in, but he says he put first the shovel into the ground. So they ended up getting it wasn't really a building, but they found a place where they could try to build their church. And so they found like this old shed type trailer type of building where they were like, we can make this our first church and we can have our church services in that. And they went to break ground and began the process of holding their church services, continuing gathering money, and build a church of their own. And so when they started to build the church of their own, and they created a location where they could actually have these church services, the Methodists continued on, right? They continued on with their Oh, hold on. Somebody say you can't hear. If anybody in the chat, let me know if y'all can hear me. I hope I haven't been doing all this and nobody can hear me. If anybody in the chat, real quick, please, just yes or no, can you hear me? Maybe let me type it. Oh man, I hope I ain't been talking for nothing. Hold on just a second. If you can hear me, bear with me. I just see a comment that says can't hear. I just now saw it. That was like 30 minutes ago. I hope I haven't been talking this long for 30 minutes and can't nobody hear me. Man, if I did all that, I'm gonna have to redo the whole show. Well, okay. Thank you for responding. So Sharidra, if I pronounced that wrong, I apologize. But thank you for responding. I was scared for a second there, man. I can't do all this over again. But okay, so once they began to create their own church and build their own church, and the Methodists knew that they technically couldn't excommunicate them if they didn't violate any rules of if they didn't violate any rules of quote unquote discipline of the Methodist Church, right? So what they ended up doing, what they ended up having to do is they further tried to use trickery. They further tried to use trickery to steal the African church and control of what they were building as an African church from Bishop Richard Allen and the others, right? So he describes how they began to build what was called Bethel. Look, he says, I bought an old frame that had been formerly occupied as a blacksmith shop from Mr. Sims and hauled it on the lot in 6th near Lombard Street that had formerly been taken for the Church of England. Remember, Church of England keeps coming up. I employed carpenters to repair the old frame and fit it for a place of worship. In July 1794, Bishop Asbury, remember that name as well, being in town, I solicited him to open the church for us, which he accepted. The Reverend John Dickens sung and prayed, and Bishop Asbury preached. The house was called Bethel, agreeable to the prayer that was made. Mr. Dickens prayed that it might be a Bethel to the gathering in of thousands of souls. Now that name Bethel, it comes from the Bible, Genesis chapter 28. There was a location in the Bible identified as Bethel. I believe it was with Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, one of them. Okay, one of them. So, and I'm going to show you Bethel here in a second. So they began to create a house of worship. They identify this house as Bethel, and they name it Bethel in reference to Genesis chapter 28. So look, check this out. So this house of worship has been favored with the awakening of many souls, and I trust they are in the kingdom, both white and colored. Our warfare and troubles now began afresh. So we're going to talk about some more persecution. He says, Mr. C proposed that we should make over the church to the conference. Again, Mr. C proposed that we should make over the church to the conference, basically saying that they should sign over all rights of the church to the conference or the Methodist connection, giving control, not having control of the church themselves, but giving control to the people who tried to refuse to allow them to create the church in the first place. This we objected to. He asserted that we could not be Methodist unless we did. Again, trying to dangle that over their head, like you ain't gonna be a Methodist unless you totally submit to us. He said, we told him he might deny us their name, the name Methodist, but they could not deny us a seat in heaven. Finding that he could not prevail with us so to do, he observed that we had better be incorporated than we could get any legacies that were left for us. If not, we could not. We agreed to be incorporated. Now, again, he's there. The white Methodists are trying yet another trick, and you're going to see the trick unfold. They came to him and he was like, well, okay, if you're not going to give us the church, if you're not going to sign it up over to us, at least do yourself a favor and get your church incorporated. Get your church incorporated so you can have legal authority and legal rights over the church building itself. And so Bishop Richard Allen and others, seeing that that was a good thing to do, they was like, okay, they agreed to be incorporated. So Mr. C, he offered to draw the incorporation himself, that it would save us the trouble of paying for to get it drawn. Now, since this guy has already incorporated several other churches for the Methodist movement, he already knows how to do it. And so he pretends to be a friend again, and he says, look, let me draw up the incorporation papers so you don't have to pay somebody else to do it. This is the least I can do. So he says, we cheerfully submitted to his proposed plan. They were tricked. They just don't know it yet. He drew the incorporation, but incorporated our church under the conference. Our property was then all consigned to the conference for the present bishops, elders, ministers, etc., that belonged to the white conference, and our property was gone. Now remember, they had collected money on their own. They had fought against the white Methodists for years. They finally bought some property. They finally began to build their church. And then this man, pretending to help, says, well, hey, let me incorporate it for you. But instead of incorporating it for them themselves, he writes on the documents that it's incorporated to the Methodist connection, right? And he gives control of the African church to the white Methodists. So he tried to play them. But see, they didn't know that. The ancestor says, being ignorant of incorporations, we cheerfully agreed thereto. So they didn't know that they were played. Remember, a lot of these individuals, they were born slaves. Now, they did get some type of education after that, but they didn't know as much as the white Methodists knew. They didn't have as much education. They didn't have as much history doing this. So they were tricked. And he says, we labored about 10 years under this incorporation until J.S. was appointed to take the charge in Philadelphia. He soon waked us up by demanding the keys and books of the church and forbid us holding any meetings except by orders from him. These propositions we told him we could not agree to. So they let that cake bake for a full 10 years. Lulled them to sleep. Rock-a-bye, baby, on the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough break, they sung them a lullaby for 10 years and let them think that they was incorporated under themselves. The whole time they had the paperwork saying that they ran Bethel. And so after 10 years, this one guy, he gets in charge, J.S., he's appointed to take charge in Philadelphia. Boom, he wake him up one day. Hey, give me the keys to the church. Give me all of the books. Give me everything, all of the treasury, all of the money, all of the offering. Give me everything. And look, y'all can't hold no meetings here. Y'all can't hold no church services here unless I tell you to. And boom, that was going to be the overthrow. And they was like, wait a minute. Whoa. No, we're not submitting to none of that. And he said, you don't have no choice because we have the incorporation papers. And so when they realized that they had been tricked 10 years prior, they were like, oh, man, they tried to get us. But they didn't lay down. And they continued to fight. right? And so they came to a basic agreement that the white Methodists said, well, all right, look, we got the incorporation papers. According to the incorporation papers, your church, this quote unquote African church, it belongs to the white connection, the white Methodist connection. We got it, right? And what we're going to do is, in order for we to let you guys run, you're going to have to pay us to send you a priest or a preacher or an elder to preach in your church every so often. Basically saying that they still got ultimate control and you can't operate unless we come in there, we see your books, we know what you're doing, and we come in there and we preach every now and then, but you have to pay us for us to come preach here. And it was kind of like a shakedown. And so they tried to say that you have to pay us X amount of money, but our ancestors stood firm. It was like, hell no. So look, they say this raised a considerable rumpus, for the elder contended that it would not be good unless he had signed it. The elder, with the trustees of St. George's, remember St. George's is the church that they left because of persecution, called us together and said we must pay $600 a year for their services or they could not serve us. We told them we were not able so to do. So now this is a monetary shakedown, and these supposed to be Christians. They shaking them down. The trustees of St. George's insisted that we should or should not be supplied by their preachers. At last, they made a move that they would take $400. We told them that our house was considerably in debt and we poor people, and we could not agree to pay $400, but we agreed to give them $200. So they're feeling the squeeze. So they're like, look, we can't pay $600, we can't pay $400, but since y'all manipulated the incorporation papers, we'll go ahead and pay $200. And so they go back and forth over the price. So they eventually come up with a price, and they eventually allow some of the people from St. George to come preach, but it was always a back and forth type of fight until eventually they kicked them out. Right? They eventually just kicked them out and was like, you can't preach here no more. The white Methodists tried to take the church from Bishop Allen because they felt like they had the trustees, and they felt like they had the incorporation papers, and so they then had to engage in some legal gymnastics, right? Some legal gymnastics to keep their church. Let me get a drink of my coffee real quick. Look, check this out. So remember, we're at the point where they're doing this back and forth over them forcing the Africans to pay them to come and preach at Bethel. So he says, but being disappointed in this plan, the plan that they were coming up with, Robert R. Roberts, the resident elder, came to Bethel, insisted on preaching to us and taking the spiritual charge of the congregation, for we were Methodists. So finally, they sent somebody to Bethel and was like, they just gonna hog the church. We're just gonna hog in there. We're just gonna go here and demand that y'all let us preach because y'all incorporated to us. So they say he was told he should come on some terms with the trustees. His answer was that he did not come to consult with Richard Allen or other trustees, but to inform the congregation that on next Sunday afternoon, he would come and take the spiritual charge. So they basically come and trying to do a coup. Roberts said, hey, I'm coming. Damn it. We taking spiritual charge of this congregation, this African church ran by African reverends. Hell no. Hell no. Y'all ain't doing it no more. The white Methodists, we got to take over. And so the trustees of Bethel says, hey, wait a minute. Hold on. If you want to come in here and preach, you have to come to terms with our trustees. And he say, look, I'm not here to talk to Richard Allen. I'm not coming to talk to no trustees. This ain't a democracy. It's a dictatorship. I'm doing no back and forth. All I came to do is come to inform y'all congregation that on next Sunday afternoon, we taking spiritual charge of this whole congregation. So he came and laid his proverbial spiritual foot down, but the ancestors wasn't having it. They said, we told him he could not preach for us under existing circumstances. Like, hell no. You can't come in here and just take spiritual charge, brother. You got to work with us. This is crazy. They tried to oppress them at every turn, but they refused. He says, however, at the appointed time he came. But having taken previous advice, we had our preacher in the pulpit when he came, and the house was so fixed that he could not get but more than halfway to the pulpit. Finding himself disappointed, he appealed to those who came with him as witnesses that man, meaning the preacher, had taken his appointment. Several respectable white citizens who knew the colored people had been ill used were present and told us not to fear, for they would see us righted and not suffer Roberts to preach in a forcible manner, after which Roberts went away. So Roberts, after making this threat, he comes back on Sunday. So when he came back, they already had their African preacher in the pulpit preaching, and they were posted up in the church and packed in such a way where they would not let him walk. He couldn't get through the crowd to get to the pulpit. They held him back. And he was like, look, he called for some witnesses and was like, look, they're refusing to let me go up there and preach. And so they was like, hey, we don't give a damn. They got some respectable white citizens in the area that knew what was going on. And they was like, look, we're going to take y'all outside. If this thing go to court, we're not going to let them take y'all church from y'all. So look, he said the next elder stationed in Philadelphia was Robert Birch, who, following the example of his predecessor, Robert Roberts, came and published a meeting for himself. But the method just mentioned was adopted, and he had to go away disappointed. So the next elder of the white Methodists, Robert Birch, he tried to do the same thing. Look, I'm taking spiritual charge of this place. He showed up on Sunday, tried to bogart the pulpit. They would not allow him to bogart the pulpit. So he went away disappointed, crying, whining, wiping his tears. So look, then they say, in consequence of this, he applied to the Supreme Court. So now they're going to the Supreme Court just so these people can't have an African church for a writ of mandamus to know why the pulpit was denied him. Being elder, this brought on a lawsuit which ended in our favor. Thus, by the providence of God, we were delivered from a long, distressing, and expensive suit which could not be resumed, being determined by the Supreme Court. For this mercy, we desire to be unfeignedly thankful. And really, like I say, in America, you got religious freedom. The Methodists came here, broke away from the Church of England, and created their own denomination in the first place because they were talking about escaping religious persecution. You can't religiously persecute people in America. They have the right. We have the right to worship and serve how we want to. So the Supreme Court said, look, you can't forcibly take spiritual charge over those people. That'll be religious persecution. The door of religion is wide open. That's why, like me right now today, I can create a church. I can create a religious denomination right now. Nobody can stop me. I can call myself a Baptist. Nobody can stop me. I can call myself a Methodist. Nobody could stop me. I could call myself Pentecostal. Nobody can stop me. You can't control me. You can't control me. If I want to build my own church and say I'm the Baptist Church of Matthew Daniels, no Baptist minister can come and say, hey, look, I'm taking charge. I'm taking spiritual charge of this church. You can't do it. So they really shot themselves in the foot because when they tried to go to the Supreme Court said, hey, no, we don't do that here. We don't religiously persecute people in America, buddy. And so the Supreme Court made it impossible for them to take this African church from these African people, right? And it thus ended a whole lawsuit, and all of their schemes came to naught when the Supreme Court ruled. Now, look, what I want to show you real quick. This is Mother Bethel AME Church. This is the church that now, of course, it didn't look like this in the picture. It didn't. Hold on, let me zoom in. Of course, it didn't look like this when Bishop Richard Allen had it built, of course. But this is Bethel Church. This is the church that grew out of them leaving St. George's. Look what it says. The Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church is an historic church and congregation which is located at 419 South 6th Street in Central City, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA. The congregation, founded in 1794, is the oldest African Methodist Episcopal congregation in the nation. Right? Because they left St. George's, they created Bethel, and then they were able to get the African Methodist Episcopal denomination recognized as the first African denomination in America. Look, they say the history of the congregation. The church was proposed in 1791 by members of the Free African Society of Philadelphia, including Absalom Jones, out of a desire to create a space for autonomous African American worship and community in the city. The desire to create the church was strengthened in 1792 after African American members of St. George's Methodist Church walked out due to racial segregation in the worship services. Mother Bethel was one of the first African American churches in the United States, dedicated July 29, 1794, by Bishop Francis Asbury. Now remember, that's the most important person to Methodism in America. On October 12, 1794, Reverend Robert Blackwell announced that the congregation was received in full fellowship in the Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1816, Reverend Richard Allen brought together other Black Methodist congregations from the region to organize the new African Methodist Episcopal Church denomination. He was elected bishop of this denomination. So this church has immense historical relevance, and we now have a little history about its creation. And even when you go to the website motherbethel.org, they let you know that Bishop Richard Allen is the founder of the AME Church and Mother Bethel AME Church, a church that grew out of our ancestors being persecuted in St. George's Methodist Church. So he will always be known as the founder of the AME Church and Mother Bethel AME Church. So Bishop Richard Allen, powerful individual, and him and others, not just him. He names the others, Absalom Jones and others. They fought hard for years for this thing to become a reality. And had they stopped fighting, had they just rolled over, they were threatened with excommunication. They were physically thrown out of one church. They drew the white Methodists drew up fake incorporation papers to try to trick them out of their church building, out of their church home. They had white Methodists come in and demand that they were going to take spiritual charge of the church, and they were going to be the ones in charge. And they sunk more than one. So they suffered persecution after persecution after persecution after persecution. But at every turn, they stood stiff. And because they stood stiff at every turn, they were able to create something of significant historical importance as the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, right? And so we can see when our ancestor describes this. Look, he says, many of the colored people in other places were in a situation nearly like those of Philadelphia and Baltimore, being persecuted. Because remember, before the denomination, African Methodist Episcopal was created, they were just Methodists. They were just fighting to be respected as Methodists. And so these Black Methodists were being, and were being persecuted in several other places. And so they were forced to come together and create their own denomination with Bishop Richard Allen at the head, their own trustees, their own conferences, and do their own thing. So he says many of the colored people in other places were in a situation nearly like those of Philadelphia and Baltimore, which induced us in April 1816 to call a general meeting by way of conference. Delegates from Baltimore and other places, which met those of Philadelphia, and taking into consideration their grievances, and in order to secure the privileges, promote union and harmony among themselves, it was resolved that the people of Philadelphia, Baltimore, etc., should become one body under the name of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. We deemed it expedient to have a form of whereby we may guide our people in the fear of God, in the unity of the Spirit, and in the bonds of peace, and preserve us from that spiritual despotism which we have so recently experienced, remembering that we are not to lord it over God's heritage as greedy dogs that can never have enough, but with long suffering and bowels of compassion to bear each other's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ, praying that our mutual striving together for the promulgation of the gospel may be crowned with abundant success. Powerful, 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 powerful. And so they go on to tell us the articles of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, but we're not going to look into that. But what I want to do before we leave, we're going to look at the acts of faith of the African Methodist Episcopal Church that Bishop Richard Allen and others put down, so we could just understand what they believe, because they had to state what they believe so you can know exactly how they interpret the scriptures as the AME denomination. Now, these types of acts of faith or declarations of faith, they go back to the councils. Remember how I showed you guys in the beginning that there were several councils: the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Trent. There were several ecumenical councils where bishops and high-ranking officials from different churches came together to decide what they were going to believe as a whole, as a unit, about the scriptures. How were they going to interpret the scriptures as a denomination? So these things continue. They may not be called councils. They may be called conferences, things like that. But whenever you have several groups uniting in faith, you have to come together and accept, like, okay, these are the articles of faith that we're going to accept together. This is what we're going to believe. And so this is no different from like the Council of Nicaea, when they came out to describe what they believed as Christians. So they say, this is what the AME Church believes. I believe, O God, that thou art an eternal, incomprehensible spirit, infinite in all perfections, who didst make all things out of nothing, and dost govern them all by thy wise providence. Let me always adore thee with profound humility as my sovereign Lord, and help me to love and praise thee with godlike affections and suitable devotion. I believe that in the unity of the Godhead there is a trinity of persons, that thou art perfectly one and perfectly three, one essence and three persons. I believe, O blessed Jesus, that thou art of one substance with the Father, the very and eternal God, that thou didst take upon thee our frail nature, that thou didst truly suffer and wert crucified, dead, and buried, to reconcile us to thy Father and to be a sacrifice for sin. I believe that according to the types and prophecies which went before of thee, and according to thy own infallible prediction, thou didst by thy own power rise from the dead the third day, that thou didst ascend into heaven, that there thou sittest on thy throne of glory, adorned by angels and interceding for sinners. I believe that thou hast instituted and ordained holy mysteries as pledges of thy love and for a continual commemoration of thy death, that thou hast not only given thyself to die for me, but to be my spiritual food and sustenance in that holy sacrament to my great and endless comfort. Oh, may I frequently approach thy altar with humility and devotion, and work in me all those holy and heavenly affections, which become the remembrance of a crucified Savior. I believe, O Lord, that thou hast not abandoned me to the dim light of my own reason to conduct me to happiness, but that thou hast revealed in the holy scriptures whatever is necessary for me to believe and practice in order to my eternal salvation. Oh, how noble and excellent are thy precepts, how sublime and enlightening the truth, how persuasive and strong the motives, how powerful the assistance of thy holy religion, in which thou hast instructed me. My delight shall be in thy statutes, and I will not forget thy word. I believe it is my greatest honor and happiness to be thy disciple. How miserable and blind are those that live without God in the world, who despise the light of thy holy faith. Make me to part with all the enjoyments of life, nay, even life itself, rather than forfeit this jewel of great price. Blessed are the sufferings which are endured. Happy is the death which is undergone for heavenly and immortal truth. I believe that thou hast prepared for those that love thee everlasting mansions of glory. If I believe thee, O eternal happiness, why does anything appear difficult that leads to thee? Why should I not willingly resist unto blood to obtain thee? Why do the vain and empty employments of life take such vast hold of us? O perishing time, why dost thou thus bewitch and deceive me? O blessed eternity, when shalt thou be my portion forever? And those are the articles of faith. Now they also tell you the acts of faith. They also go into the book, the acts of hope, that the AME church hold dear as well. So this video, as we bring it to a close, we've been talking about the Bishop Reverend Allen, the foundation or the creation of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that denomination, and the events that led up to it. So as always, as I wrap this thing up and bring this presentation to a close, you've already been here over 2 hours, so I don't want to hold you too much longer than that. I hope you heard something that you never heard before. If you did hear something that you have heard before, I hope I was able to provide more clarity and give you guys more information on the subject matter. And I hope I gave you a better understanding of Bishop Richard Allen and the founding of the AME Church. So thank you all for watching. If you haven't already, before you leave, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you can be aware whenever I go live. I appreciate it. And you can leave me a comment if anybody's in the watching this video after it's aired or is watching it now. If you are a member of the AME Church, I would like to hear about your experiences with the AME Church. And did you know the details about this history that I just shared with you guys? So this has been Bishop Richard Allen and the founding of the AME Church, 1816. Let the ancestors speak. Sharidra says, great video as always. Keep bringing our roots. Thank you for tapping in. Thank you for watching, and thank you for the kind words. And I'll definitely keep bringing this information. We're going to continue to let the ancestors speak. So as always, may your name, as well as the names of the ancestors, live on forever. And may your memory, family, your memory never die. Hotep, I'm out. I hope you guys have a great weekend and a great life.